Oh, yeah, it is the Songwriting for Guitar After Hours podcast. Here we are. Again, this is the second time that I've been doing this. Last week I said I was going to be consistent with this, and here I am. I am true to my word, showing up for the second time. And I'm looking forward to doing more of these because I kind of went back and, I rewatched myself. You kind of have to watch and be like, what is it like? And I was like, oh, okay. So I kind of go into, some more tidbits. I'm talking more about it. I was like, okay, I'm excited to see how this is going to shape up. And I think especially this week, because I talk about books. So, well, I didn't just talk about books. Heather Taylor and I talked about books. But before we get into this week's kind of episode and my thoughts about it and some of my stories behind the books, how I've discovered them, let me remind you that this is an amazing podcast that you can subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't already. Rusty, what's up? How you doing? Rusty, I'm going to give you the ultimate fan badge because this, you were here last week. You were here for episode 1. Now you're here for episode 2. So, if you haven't yet, make sure you like and subscribe to this channel because it does matter and you'll get alerts when I go live and when we put out new content. And of course, if this is an after hours podcast, that means there has to be a actual podcast, another one that you can get on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all those other streaming platforms. And all you got to do is right by me. I think, wait a minute, there we go. Right here is the QR code. If you scan it, takes you straight to our podcast. And right now we're at episode 91. I think that's insane. Again, I went even deeper into how long do podcasts last. Did you know the average podcast, most podcasts, barely make it to 4 or 5 episodes? I thought it was more than that. But no, it's usually 4 or 5 because they batch a lot at the beginning. And then after that, they're just like, oh, this is hard. And then they just stop. So that's why you'll notice a lot of podcasts have just a couple episodes. And then before you know it, they just kind of vanish off of the face of the earth. But not us. Here we are in the Apple podcast form. And remember, the YouTube form that you can, of course, like and subscribe. So we got the YouTube version. We got the podcast version. And we're just going to dive into this week's episode. And this week's episode was Unblocking Creative Potential. And probably years ago, I thought I would think it would be counterproductive to read a book about, all these different processes or the things I talked about, or mindset, business, when it comes to even just the thoughts of creativity, because I'd be like, if you have a certain amount of time in the day, why not spend that writing songs instead? Why are you reading books? Why are you thinking about? And it's because you have to expand. And if I'm just going with the knowledge that I have and just the views that I have, it's a very one-sided way of creativity. And these books have opened up my view of how I write songs, how I conduct business, how I think of myself as a brand, how I think of songwriting for guitar as a brand. And the first one that I talked about is Who Not How. And I read this, I'd gotten this one at the beginning of 2001. I know that it's weird that I know the dates of when I got these books or when they were introduced. And I think that's because when something is really important, I don't know, it's just like we have this little mental imprint. And Who Not How, I remember I got in the beginning of 2021. I don't know if it was recommended to me, but that book was floating around, and I read it before we did a Songwriting for Guitar boot camp. And this is when it was just a one-man operation, where it was just me. I shouldn't say it was a one-man operation. My girlfriend, now fiance, soon-to-be wife next week, Jen, would help me, but it was a lot. It was a ton. And the principles behind Who Not How is if you find that there's something that needs addressing, or it's just like, oh, I need to, these things need to happen. Now, I could take on that role, but then that's going to pull me away from other things that I need to do. Now, most of us are trying to juggle lots of things. The Who Not How principle goes, okay, so who do I need to get that outcome? Who can help me get there? And so in February of that same year, after reading that book, so I've been thinking about that purpose, that's where Heather Taylor came into songwriting for guitar, and started out as my assistant, and then eventually became COO. And she's going to be. It's hard to believe. I think we're coming up on 3 years, which is just kind of blows my mind just a little bit. But it started with just an email from her being like, "Hey, can I help you? I'm a virtual assistant, and I would love to take your course right now, but I can't. But can I just be your assistant? Do you need any help that I could, kind of work off the price of the course?" And I was like, God, that is so ingenious. It wasn't like she was like, "Give me a job." Her intro to the conversation was, "How can I help you?" And I'm like, huh. I was like, wow. And it just, and it was a great introduction to each other, and a great way for her to come into the company. And I think about that a lot when there are opportunities. So if we were to keep on with that who, not how principle, if we have that really refined strength, and for me, when it was, in the songwriting realm, it was writing songs with my guitar and being able to communicate them effectively. I would go to artists, I would go to producers that needed help in that area, and I was like, how can I help? So that idea of refining your strength and then to initiate the conversation, not be like, what can you do for me? But instead, like, how can I help you? How can I use this? How can I use the strength that I have and help you out? I think that's a huge asset. And when I think of who, not how, I think of that time, or basically that early 2021, where I was thinking about, man, you need an assistant, Mike. You need an assistant. You need an assistant. Like, you need an assistant. And I met Heather. And so that's always, to me, like that book, which I highly recommend. Anyone in the creative field, anyone starting out a business, who, not how. And we mentioned lots of others, but there's one that I want to dive into even more, and that's High Performance Habits, and that's Brendon Burchard. And I think I mentioned, too, in the episode, I've seen him twice. Now, I was a very skeptical individual when it comes to kind of like the motivational speaker realm, because for a while I was like, I think it's kind of bullshit. If I'm being honest, I think there's some that I may, that I saw in that realm that I was like, you don't resonate with me, and it feels weird, or it just like, I don't know, it just didn't work. But Brendon Burchard, if you don't know his story, he was a person that came close to death several times, and his whole job is helping people understand those that are at very high levels, whether they be CEOs, presidents, Fortune 500 companies, celebrities. They have to operate at a level that's a little bit different. They have to have these habits in place because some of their basically everything that they do is at a level that's very, very demanding. Are there traits that they all share? Is there a common trait? Are there things that I can look for and distill down for someone who's just starting out in a business, just starting out in a brand new career like songwriting, that's starting out into a new realm, that can study those and use them to create better habits so that they have sustainability, that they maintain that? When I heard him talk about it that way, it was less of kind of like a cheesiness, but like a practicality of like, oh, these make sense. And he studied this for years. He had like 20 years of just deep diving into this process. And I was like, okay, you have my attention. As opposed to the other ones, I feel like, when I think of motivational speakers, I used to think of like the really cheesy late night 90s kind of like infomercials where it would be like a fake interview with like a fake person. And so that's how I always viewed motivational speakers. But him as to not be a motivational coach, but to be a high performance coach, because he then founded, a company that is based around high performance habits. The one that still blows my mind that I never thought of, and is really I think, a culprit to a lot of our frustrations and a lot of why things sometimes don't happen. He talks about transitions. And I'm very guilty in my life before really, really thinking about this. The transitions every day that I go through from task to task. Do I actually think about, like, okay, this task is ending, and now I'm going to the next thing, and now I'm going to the next thing? Or do I just go from the next thing without acknowledging the transition? So meaning, if I have an argument, I don't know, let's say I have a co-write, and the co-write goes really bad, which, lots of co-writes go bad. Co-writes can go bad. Do I carry that emotion over when, let's say, then Jen and I get lunch, or we get dinner? Or before we get dinner, do I stop and acknowledge, okay, I'm feeling really anxious, and I'm feeling stressed, I'm feeling annoyed, I'm feeling frustrated because the thing that I thought was going to be complete and the song that was going to get done didn't get done, and I'm annoyed as hell. But I'm about to go and do something completely different. It's unfair to that situation, that person, to carry over this angst, which they have nothing to do with, and that situation has nothing to do with. I acknowledge that I'm now changing, and it's not saying I have to let that right go or, whatever, but it's not fair to that person that I'm going to be now doing a new thing with to carry over this, like, annoyance and, like, snippiness, I guess. Because I think in the past I get very snippy. If something annoys me, and I know people say, well, that's being human. It is being human, but just recognizing that, this is going to end and I'm starting something new. Because I think a lot of us operate on a level of just like, well, this didn't go well, and this is how we're going to be for the rest of the day. I think, we all used to work with someone that's like, oh, don't go near so-and-so when they're like, da-da-da. Well, when is so-and-so going to realize, like, whatever may have happened to them, that's understandable. It's time to go into a new task. So when he described transitions, I became aware of them. I was not perfect. I'm still not perfect on transitions, but I like to think I'm a hell of a lot better when going from the next thing into the next thing. I really make a conscious choice to be like, now I'm transitioning. Like, when I'm done with this, my day is going to be done. So that means I'm going to shut everything down. I'll turn this off. And then any conversations or things that have happened today in the studio, or thoughts about tomorrow, thoughts that I want to jot down, or, meetings that are going to happen, I'm going to leave them here. And then I'm going to walk out that door, and we're going to sit down, and our pup will come out, and my day is, I'm making a transition. And the reason that's important is it's going to save our energy. Too many of us are wasting our energy, I think, over and over one particular stressful thing or annoyance. And it drags over. Like, how many of us think about it when the day is done, and the first thing that when we wake up the next day, it's still on our mind? That's not a healthy sign. So that's a sign that we need to work on our transitions. And it's not saying that we have to ignore that thing, but we just have to realize we're moving into something else, and that thing doesn't apply to it. I know it sounds like such a simple thing, but that's one of the hardest things I struggled with. And I think that's why I still connect with Brendan Burchard, because his message is attuned to those that are working on these habits, these high performance habits. But he knows we're not going to master them. He knows that he doesn't master them. And so there constantly needs to be refinement. There constantly needs to be encouragement. There constantly needs to be a time that we're working on bettering ourselves in these habits. And I've gotten a chance to see him speak twice, and he's just electrifying, because you can tell that he's very sincere. When you meet someone, you're like, oh, you're really fake. You can tell a phony. But he is just, the energy and everything that he gives is just so good. I I think I wanted to spend way more time talking about high performance habits and how much it means to me and Brendan Bouchard, but we had 5 books, but I saw him speak last year, and then just in June I saw him speak again, and it was just, so good. And that's why I always say, like, if there's an app that he has that's called Growth Day, he created a company called Growth Day, and the app I start every day with, because if I go into it right now, what's awesome, and we'll put links, and in the podcast we even give a link, but when I open it up, there is automatically the daily fire. He has a new piece of training every single morning, and so I'm always clicking that little button right there. I also do these little scores, which I love. They're called life scores. It's just like an end of the day result, like just kind of assessment, which I love, because if you're not assessing your day, if you're not assessing how did it go, for me, I don't think enough about what's going well. I tend to think about what's going wrong. Mike, what's up, man? And I saw your post. Dude, November. So are you playing a show? Is the show happening? Is it your first show? I would love to know, man. But Growth Day, I love the life score section because I don't assess when things are going well. I'm so caught up in everything, so that I take a little piece of my day at the end to just kind of score, like, hey, how was my energy level? How was I feeling? Was I feeling great? Was I feeling out of focus? I think it's a great way to recenter and just kind of capture information about the day. And over time, I can pull this up and see throughout, like, I can view my history of like different scores throughout the month, so I can start to see patterns, which is really cool. One thing I thought was interesting with this episode, people were like, you didn't cover any songwriting books, because I see, Rusty, you said The Craft of Lyric Writing by Shelley Davis. I found it to be super helpful. I wanted to add lots of books. It was hard to distill it down to 5. One that I would highly recommend. Where is it? Got it right back here. It's the Songwriter Survival Guide, and it's by Judy Stakee. And this is by far one of the best books on the craft of writing, song structure, and creative habits. If you don't know Judy Stakee, she's my mentor, but she worked at Warner Chappell for over 30 years, creative senior VP. The book is forwarded by Sheryl Crow because she discovered Sheryl Crow, which blows my mind. But Judy's the most humble, sweetest person and mentor that I've had in my life. She developed Katy Perry when Katy Perry was making the switch from Christian over to mainstream. She developed her, which I think is insane. Joy Williams, Michelle Branch, Gavin DeGradual. There's so many songwriters. Her job at Warner Chappell was literally to bring on new songwriters and have them for 2 years and just develop their writing so that they would write quality songs. And she focuses on 3 things that I love, which is melody, lyrics, and voice. And what I mean by voice is not like singing, but like your authentic self, diving deep into what are the songs that are going to relate to a large amount of people, but still be true to yourself. And she's the only person I know that's been really good at describing this. And so if we had like 6, if this podcast was like, 6 creative books, this would be book number 6 right here for me. Songwriting Survival Guide. I got this when I took a retreat back in, when was this? Wow. It's hard to believe. This is October 2019, which I'm like, really? 2019? Feels like it was a while ago, but it wasn't. But now I feel really honored that I now teach at her retreats. I'll be teaching at one of her retreats in Nashville in September, I think. Mike, we have a slot with a punk hardcore festival. Dude, I'm so excited for you. That's amazing. I coached Mike for a good, 3 years. one of his first sessions with me, he was like, man, I just want to be in a band. I just want to start a really good band, and I just want to play shows, and I want to write my own songs, and I want it to be my message, my thing, and I want it to be like shape it. And it took a while. I mean, we also had a pandemic in the middle, so give or take. But here we are now on the other side. I love, and you were ahead. I think his goal was to have at least some of the members, or at least one member by like May with the songs, and you were well ahead of that. And here you are, man. Dude, that is just so phenomenal. I love that, because that's something you've wanted to do. And I think that's why the books that I recommended on this podcast in particular are ones that I reread continuously again and again and again, because it applies to both aspects. Because I wear essentially two hats. I wear kind of like CEO, founder hat of Songwriting for Guitar, overseeing other people and courses and workshops and future programs. And then the other hat I have is a songwriter, producer, composer. And both of those require the same amount of attention, the same amount of momentum. And the 5 books that I've recommended, I feel, add a lot of fuel to the fire and essentially just help me stay focused, because both those things, being a CEO and founder, and then on top of it, being a songwriter, producer, composer, it's a lot of patience, and it's a lot of allowing things to develop over time. Because if you start a company, it's not going to be, even now, I'd still say we're still in the early stages, because, most companies, you need at least like 10 years for it to fully develop to where it could be. And the same thing, songwriting, production, composing, you can't just write a couple songs out of the gate and expect the best to be, the first couple. If anything, you need mentors, you need coaches, you need workshops, you need retreats, you need to start building a songwriting circle that are equally, if not better than you, that they're pushing you as well. But that takes time to develop. So both of those things in my life have taken time and patience, and seeing long-term where you want it to go, and being willing to work on that and stay patient with it, which isn't always the case. But that's why those 5, Who Not How, The Gap in the Gain, High Performance Habits, Big Magic, and Anatomy of a Breakthrough. Anatomy of Breakthrough is just new, because after all these books that I've been recommending, what I love about working with the people that I have within the Songwriting for Guitar camp, we're always sharing books, and I'm always telling them about certain books. But Heather was like, you've got to read Anatomy of a Breakthrough. And I downloaded it on Audible, and it was just, it's a phenomenal book, because it talks about, the messy middle. And I think both running a company and doing songwriting and production is a messy middle, meaning we always think about the allure of the beginning and the end. Like, we love beginnings because beginnings are so much fun. It's new, it's exciting. And we love it because it's the result that we want. Nobody talks about the middle because it's boring. It's frustrating. Like, for instance, patience is long-term. Like Mike, what you're resulting in is because of your patience, and you're willing to see the vision of what you want and stay with it. Because, man, wouldn't it suck if you just like stopped year 2 and you just went like, I guess it's not going to happen. But instead, you just stayed consistent with yourself, and you were willing to go with it. That's what I always love, because that to me is much more interesting. That's another example of like, oh yeah, staying patient, but you were also willing to pivot at certain areas. Maybe not worry about this. Okay, now let me focus on this. You're willing to take that advice too. And like, if I was like, hey, let's not do this, let's focus on this. Even if you were like, you were willing to entertain the idea, and you were willing to stretch yourself. You were willing to grow. And Anatomy of a Breakthrough really talks about that, just that messy middle. But that is the most crucial part of your journey, because that's where you have to turn up the intensity. That's where you have to focus, because it's just like, that is the thing that matters. And that's usually why people don't, I had lots of, I'm based in Nashville now, it's hard to believe, almost 2 years. It doesn't feel like 2 years. But when I used to live in Pittsburgh, I had a few friends that moved out to Nashville, but they were back a year later and they would come back. Oh, it didn't work out. I'm like, you didn't even give it a year and you're already back. What did you think? It was going to happen overnight? You know, they say Nashville is a 10-year town, but I think any year is I think life could be a 10-year town, no matter where you live. It's just, what is your vision? And do you have a long-term mindset? Are you willing to be patient and stay with it? And so I think these books, replicate or at least address that really well, especially Anatomy of a Breakthrough. So I give Heather 1,000,000 points for that. That was a huge, that was a gigantic book that I was just like, oh shit, I never thought of that. So, if you didn't listen to this week's episode, because this is what it is. This is the After Hours podcast where I talk about, just little bits of my podcast, thoughts about why we chose to do this, stories in between. But I actually have a real podcast. This is like, and so if you're you're watching this whenever, I don't know if you're watching this a couple days later or a year later. If you scan this little QR code, it's going to take you right to my podcast. Episode 91 we're talking about. And if you haven't liked or subscribed to this channel, well, come on. You might as well, because there are going to be other good videos eventually that we're going to release. So that's this week's After Hours podcast about episode 91. So regardless of the books that you choose, I would really encourage any creative, regardless if you are starting a songwriting business, like you want to do this for real, full time, or you're just starting out and you're interested in just entertaining the idea, reading will always expand and reading will always be super, super helpful. And the 5 that I've mentioned in these books, Who Not How, The Gap in the Gain, High Performance Habits, Big Magic, Anatomy of Breakthrough, I think will help deal with the messy middles and all those obstacles that are in between. Because again, remember, the beginning and the end of our journey. The beginning is always fun because it's new. The end, we love it because it's the result we want. But it's always that middle part where we really have to dig in a little bit and put the work in. So those are the 5 that I would recommend. And thanks everybody for hanging out with this this episode. This was fun. And thank you, Rusty, for next week getting married. Who would have thunk it? Well, I will be here for the After Hours podcast. I will still be technically not married yet. Our marriage doesn't happen until next Saturday. So not this coming Saturday, but the following Saturday. And we don't have to go far. It's going to be a super tiny wedding. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be good. But thank you, Rusty. And Mike, thanks for joining. And we'll see everybody next week because guess what? Consistency. The After Hours podcast. This is going to be going on for the rest of the year. Right now, guess what? 2 were on last week there was just 1. This week, 2. Staying consistent, because my goal is I would love, maybe by the end of the year, we get 20 people. Because if you're going to build something long-term, you got to be patient and you got to show up like you want to show up when the whole room is stacked. So there we go. All right, everyone, have a great week and I'll see you next week.